first of all, thank you so much for that introduction. I know it's really hard to say Google Doodler, but I had like 6.5 years to practice it. This is your first time? Okay, so my presentation is called Your Face Here. I once heard a joke about this being turned into like a dirty, like, innuendo, and that is not what I was going for. I'm getting a little feedback. I'm gonna step back. Okay. So when I first started at Airbnb at the end of 2017, this is what they had with their brand. This is their brand history. So a quick overview is to show that it went from a really quick startup logo to what I lovingly call the laundromat sticker phase around 2010 and 2013. And now since 2014, it's rebranded with this logo mark that we call the Balo. But the illustration history of the company is very similar to any other major tech company. It started with a freelancer and a single project where an executive just needed to have illustrations for one slide deck. Maybe to the company's credit, this is all the assets that they had, but everyone at the company assumed that these illustrations were now the brand illustrations for the company. So they ran with that. But then shortly after, a junior designer came on board and she incorporated her own personal style. So this is what that looked like. It's very different from the previous work. And after her, another junior illustrator joined. Technically, she was a designer, and then she made an attempt to merge the previous two styles with also the Balo in mind. So it was very stroke-based, and it was very playful. You can see that everything is like pretty freehand. It's not really based in reality. It's very approachable, which was completely fine with this like rounded aesthetic for a startup. But when I came on board, things needed to change. Also, here are some of the icons that we had in our library. It follows the same philosophy of essentially stroke-based illustrations and icons with a little spot of color. Okay. Before I attempted to draw anything at Airbnb, I wanted to make sure that I understood the landscape for our peers within the tech sphere. And these are kind of small, so please forgive me. And I'm going to start from right to left because I feel like it. So I had an eye strictly on how other companies were dealing with human interaction, because Airbnb is in the unique business of selling experiences and interactions across cultures and amongst people across countries. So Casper has anthropomorphized animals that are having non-sexy parties on beds. Dropbox had IKEA people with really wild patterns. Google had literally the same cookie cutter human shape with some people that are slightly lighter or slightly darker than others. Lyft had mostly Caucasian people with the occasional magenta person. Etsy had a monochromatic style as well. Actually, my friend was at Etsy. Oh, sorry, that's Uber. I was at Uber at the time. I know that they had monochromatic stuff because I was there, and it was all black and white people. Etsy was similar, monochromatic. Facebook had what I called rainbow people, where everyone was kind of like Fruit Loop color. They were purple and blue and green and yellow and magenta, but they were never flesh-toned. And 23andMe, arguably the most human-oriented tech company in the entire valley, in that they mapped your chromosomes. Didn't portray people at all, but I have nothing bad to say about them because they have my DNA, and I don't want them to use that in ways that I don't agree with. Okay, so our future. As you've heard from all of the previous speakers, people usually start with principles. These were the ones that I proposed. First and foremost, it had to be scalable, just because I was an illustrator on product, and everyone knows that product illustration and assets are used across all different kinds of OSs, platforms. They're MoWeb, they're desktop, they're native iOS and Android, all that stuff. So it had to be in vector, scale up and scale down. They also had to be a little more grounded than the previous style. It had to be a little bit less childish, less rounded. Because as I was coming in, we were getting into Airbnb Plus and Airbnb Lux, which were highly curated forms of listings offered on Airbnb. So we wanted to be a little bit more serious. They also had to be lightweight because illustrations live in a system. They live in the design system. And our design language system happens to have a lot of white space, a lot of breathing room. So it couldn't suck up all the attention from the rest of the design language system. And it also needed to be diverse. And the last point is the one that I want to talk about the most. But first, I'll talk about color. We've already had a wonderful presentation about color. When I came in, this is the color that This is the palette that I was given. They're labeled here, so you know what Roush is. Fun story, Roush is technically not accessible yet, and we're all working on it right now. So my coworker Kari came to me with this palette for the brand, and I knew that it was not going to be enough for illustration. So when I was building out the illustration palette, I made sure that our philosophy on light followed a shift in not just value, but also a shift in temperature. So anything that became lighter also became warmer. Anything that became darker also became cooler. This prevented what I call hospital lighting or Walgreens lighting. It's very sad and it's very drab when things just become whiter or darker. It kind of sucks the temperature and the feeling out of the room. It's like a sunset versus a hospital. So this is what I came up with as our near final palette. You can see that the value spectrums are built out for all of the major colors for the brand, but I was missing something really critical, and that was the part that addresses my need for diversity in illustration. So I added this, which is what I call the hair and skin palette, which is not the best name, but it was better than flesh, and I thought that I'd rather say hair and skin than flesh all the time, because it's disgusting. Okay, so when I actually started drawing, I focused on our smallest incidences and probably our highest use case, and that is small spot illustrations. Most companies call them icons, but at Airbnb, they're being blown up and sized down to the point where you would see icons on a page that were both 1 pixel stroke weight and then up to 10, so it was pretty horrifying. So when I was building out our icon to spot illustration system, I made sure that every major concept had expressions in 3 major tiers. They scaled up in size and they scaled up in complexity. They even changed the concept as they went up in size. Because when you have a larger canvas, you want to make sure that the illustration looks like it was built for that canvas size. You can get a little bit more complex with your metaphors here too. I hope you can tell which is before and after, but the left is before and the right is after. You can see that there's less rounding. It's a little bit more grounded in geometry and straight lines. I'm turning the focus of the illustrations from the person's hair and shirt and device to the person herself. Because we are a company that's not about the devices, we're not really about the emails that you get or the listings that you see. We're mostly about the experiences that people have when they go on these trips. So I wanted to flip the focus just by flipping what is considered stroke and what is considered fill. More complex are the medium and large spot illustrations. So these are depictions of larger scenes of people interacting with each other. I went through a few explorations for this. I like to explore really, really wide and not just assume that I know what is going to be the right solution right off the bat. So I did something really horrible that I never wanted to see ever again, but it was the middle row and the last column. It's called the 1990s Lipton commercial collage, and it was really disgusting and uncanny. It just decapitated people from their photographs and drew a body underneath. It was horrible. And then I straight up drew aliens below that, and I was ripping off of Alexander Gerard dolls. And I even played with the Fruit Loop colored people because I wasn't yet in a space where I felt comfortable talking about diversity yet at a large scale. But then I talked to my director, and my director said, why aren't you doing exactly what you said you wanted to do, which was portray diversity? So he's like, you're running away from it, and he told me to go here. So this is where I ended up. This follows a few art history philosophies, like some Scandinavian travel posters and some Japanese paintings that use fill and stroke very cleverly. They set a lot of context in their landscapes, but they never overstate the subject. So they use stroke for things that are in the background, they use fill for things that are the focus, and I wanted to maintain that kind of visual language when we're working at Airbnb. So wherever the narrative focus is, that's what gets the heaviest weight in the image that gets filled, and anything that's setting the context, like the house of the host, that's to show you that she's a host, that gets a stroke, or the suitcase of the traveler is to show you that he's the guest, so it's stroked as well. As we zoom in on people and deal with their expressions and details of their faces when they interact, I was exploring here. Again, I did this in parallel with the larger body illustration, so I was still doing amorphous amoeba shapes behind people and jello-colored hair and just random stuff. And my director was like, yeah, that's cute, keep trying to do weird stuff, but you should probably go back to what we decided on before. So again, I ended up here where you have two distinctly different characters. Clearly, they're not the same cookie cutter human being, and they have real skin tones. But as I was starting to codify how I was moving forward with this illustration, I received some feedback from coworkers that was unsolicited. And normally, unsolicited feedback is not good. It usually means that you messed up. But my coworkers came up to me, and they happened to both be people of color, and they said, "Thank you for this character in particular." They wanted to say that they were happy that I drew this woman not as like a Barbie, like stick figure, like commercially acceptable female form. And I was like, well, that's like really kind of you. And I thought about it a little bit, and then I, like, as we do, listened to a podcast. I happened to listen to one that was about an advertiser from the 1960s. He said that black people are not dark-skinned white people. And the context here is that he was working on a commercial that there was a white version and then a black version. The white version was a family that was in their home, and they were just advertising something. Then they yelled, "Cut." They took out the white cast, they put in the black cast, but they didn't change the set. And the set had photos of the white family. So his thing was like, black people are not just dark-skinned white people. And I was like, yeah, that's totally right. So my takeaway here is, sorry, I think it's my necklace. Okay, my takeaway here is to always get reference. And that is because we are driving towards authenticity, and we want to represent diversity in as fair and honest way and respectable way as possible. We're not trying to reinvent what we think people are or trying to reskin things. We want to actually represent people. And another pitfall besides falling into stereotype pitfalls, besides falling into stereotypes, is that every illustrator tends to draw the face that she or he sees most often every single day. And if I didn't get references, then my illustrations would end up looking like this. And then all of Airbnb would end up looking like this, and that would be kind of a nightmare. My mom would be happy, but that's about it. So I ask every single illustrator who works with me to get reference every single time. And this means that an illustration at Airbnb could be literally anyone, including my ex-boyfriend, who I didn't edit out of this slide to prove a point, that literally anyone could be an Airbnb. Okay, so this is to reinforce our internal philosophy that applies company-wide, which is belong anywhere. So whenever we cast, we make sure that we cast things extremely deliberately, and we keep an eye on how many different kinds of people we have in our library. So here are some examples of befores and afters. On the left is an example of the one representation of a guest and a host that we had in our library. And on the right are just 4 representations of how we can change that up. We've done many more since this. But true to my teaching here of my references, that's my favorite K-pop star on the top, and that's Idris Elba below him. That is one of my friends from RISD, the Asian woman, and then that's also at the very top left, that is my friend Ishan's mother, and I thank her for giving me her photo reference, but she didn't actually, I just stole it from Facebook. It's not launched anywhere, so it's not illegal. Okay, so here are some more examples of how we're representing different kinds of people. This is Denai Gurira from the Black Panther, and that's Stephen Yen from The Walking Dead. Love you, Stephen. I didn't draw that one, but I was very pleased to see that my coworker wanted to draw Stephen Yen. So digging farther into diversity, I worked pretty closely with one of my coworkers named Michael Sui. He is in charge of inclusivity and accessibility design, and he has affiliations with affinity groups with people who identify as living with a disability. So he got me in contact with National Council on Independent Living and a few other groups within Airbnb, and they started giving us references for people who live with disabilities, because 10% of the world's population has some kind of disability. And some are very visible, like a prosthetic leg here, and some are a little bit less visible, like a cochlear implant. This has been a really interesting research phase that I went through, because I found out little nuances about each group they identify differently even within their same demographic. So the deaf or hard of hearing community, some of them wear cochlear implants and some of them are against it. Some of them are saying that we should probably just represent deaf or hard of hearing as sign language. And I was like, that's really cool. So then that becomes an animation challenge as well. Oh, that's Childish Gambino up top. Then there are nods to invisible disabilities, such as like differences in cognitive ability. And this is more of like a hint to someone who could be on the autistic spectrum. Some people will wear headphones and carry them around with them so that they can put them on and take them off whenever they need to focus and then whenever they need to talk to other people. So to anyone else who is not part of this group, this may just seem like a dude with headphones, but someone who lives with this disability like may recognize that as like, oh, that's something that I do too. And we want to be kind of like subtle, and we want to keep it as normal as possible because these are just people. It's not just like for a narrative purpose that we're including people with disabilities just because people are this way. Okay, so here's a little snack in the middle because my coworker decided to do this for me. It's so cute. Okay. So as we, thank you. Everyone's making the same like, thank you joke. Okay, so here are illustrations. This is when things get larger, they take up more space. They're not living necessarily within the flow of a page with white space, but they're at the top. They're considered like the cover of the book rather than the spots inside. So these typically live in emails, and again, we have more complex illustrations that deal slightly more with space and atmospheric perspective. We're blurring some of the edges to also get a sense of depth in these, but essentially we are casting the same, we are drawing the same, we're just adding a little bit of color complexity with blending modes. Here's another example of an email that went out to everyone who became a super host in the last year. That's the top, I think, 5% of hosts on our platform. We start to use a lot of metaphor. Here's the animated version of this. So this is to congratulate hosts for all the hard work that they put into their listings, and it's turned into something beautiful. Okay. Here are illustrations as we dive into our community become very different. So in China, we have this thing called China Stories, where guests who have stayed on the Airbnb platform can write a short article about their experiences, and these articles are treated like a piece of editorial, and we will pair it with an illustration. But we also want to make sure that we are using a guest voice as a writer, so we're bringing in a guest artist. Here's an example of a guest artist who worked on a story about the Chinese opera in Chengdu, I believe. I don't read Chinese, so I'm not really sure what it says. But anyway, this is an example of how we're scaling our system to reach out into the community and bring in other people that are not necessarily operating in the house style. Here are more examples from that same wave. These are 4 separate illustrators. Some of them are Chinese from China. Some of them are Chinese American, because these are all Chinese authors. So we wanted to pair them with people who actually made sense of the demographic and the experiences. Some of these artists are from Tokyo, because some of these articles are about traveling in Tokyo. Okay, so the whole system together looks like this. And when people think of illustrations, they don't necessarily think of like, this is an entire spectrum. It's how it stretches and scales depending on the use case. And illustration is not always the stuff that you see on the right. Most of it is actually on the left, but it still has to grow and shrink amongst the most narrative cases and all the way down to the most functional cases. So I thought that I was hot shit when I had developed the system, and I was like, oh, cool, it's totally global. I'm referencing literally everyone under the planet or on the planet. And then I went to China, and China was another story. I was like, okay, so what does diversity in China mean? Because we're treating our Chinese counterpart of Airbnb as focused on people who work in, travel in, and host in China. So China, China, China. And I was like, okay, so it's not the same kind of diversity that we see in America or the rest of the world, but there are different kinds of people in China who look like people, basically. So I went into my Facebook friend group, and I pulled out a bunch of my Chinese American friends, and that is the first 4 columns. And the second 2 columns, or the last 2 columns, are real super hosts who host on the Chinese platform. I also wanted to see how other companies were representing emotion in China and what other platform is best than stickers from WeChat. And I only noticed at Clarity that I accidentally included like this bondage one. I actually noticed that on stage at your conference, so I left it in there because I thought it was cute. Anyway, so while we can't draw bondage marshmallow people, we can take cues from the way that the expression is conveyed here, and that's usually with like augmented extra calligraphy, hearts, stars, music notes. It just like has this like a tiny bit of extra sparkle to it. So I took the reference and I merged it with a little bit of addition like augmented gestures, and I ended up here. And I thought like, hey, this is pretty cool. I'm gonna go to the Chinese team, I'm gonna get feedback, they're gonna applaud me, I'm gonna eat a bow and go home. And then they had feedback for me, I was like, that's cool. So they started off with saying, these eyes are too red, they look like these women have rabies. They said that my friend, whom I lovingly call Hot Michael Jang, was simply too hot. He was so clearly Chinese American, he was too hot. I was like, okay. Jang, oh, not Jang, that is Jang actually. My friend from art school, her cheekbone expression was not ideal for them. My friend Leonard on the bottom, they said that he was an unideal body type, but they would accept him anyway. And I was like, okay, I would never tell him that. And then my favorite one was that Sean up top had a little bit of green to express the division of hair on his head. And they said that that is a signal of a man being cheated on by his wife. And I was like, well, that would literally never happen because Sean is gay. But it was like nice to know anyway. So I made some changes, and the biggest change is that Hot Michael Jang just like literally had to go. I replaced him with a guy who actually just worked in the Chinese office. They can never say that he looked too Chinese American. But my biggest teaching from talking to the Beijing office is that even though I am technically Chinese, I am very Chinese American. And I'm hard pressed to assume that I understand what Chinese mainlanders understand who look Chinese. So I was like, shit. I really learned my lesson about localization and diversity. But it was fun because I made these changes and then they were happy. And moving forward with the Chinese team, they provide me with references before I ever assume to know what like culturally Chinese person looks like. A little more fun with the China team. They needed an avatar to simply show in the app how to take a photo of your face to trigger their face identification. So I sent them that first image. They said the hair was just too heavy visually, so they asked for more hairstyles. And I was like, cool, that's fine. So I sent them these two, and then they liked the first one to the right of the line, which was like vaguely based on my own hairstyle at the time. But then they're like, yeah, but it's actually like really outdated. And I was like, oh God, that's so embarrassing. So I felt really badly about myself and my own life choices. But then they sent me references for like actually in fashion hair. And I was like, okay, at least I'm not in China, so no one can make fun of me to my face. So I gave them an edit based on their references. And then they came back, they're like, just kidding, it was fine. You didn't have to feel shame for that day that we shamed you. It's like, okay. But then the real thing that they wanted were color changes, and this was really interesting because the commercially acceptable aesthetic in China is like very, very overexposed skin tones, so like super, super white, and light hair. And I was like, that's fine. I'm not gonna create a new palette for China, but I will knock the swatch back to one value lighter in the palette that we already have. So we met in the middle where I made the compromise where I kept it within the realm of like a realistic skin tone, but I also lightened it for them. And I still keep in some variety for the Chinese market. So style usage. And we see, like this is illustration, these are the uses, that's fine, like this is how to do it, but people use it in wacky, wacky ways. But the biggest thing is that whenever I get requests, everyone wants their illustration to be like super special and animated and sparkly and 3D, and I'm like, not everything can be special. That's essentially what this says. And here is why, because some things are very functional and some things are very narrative. Here are some examples of like super overdone illustration mocks that I actually got from real designers. Thankfully, none of them are here, so they can't see me talking shit about them. But the idea here is that this is just a page where it says, welcome to our community. That's it. It's not like, welcome to our community, this is a feature film of summer 2019. Like, it's not that. So take away the full bleed, just keep it very simple up top. The next one is check your email. They wanted to have trains and planes and automobiles flying behind your email. And I'm like, no, that's ridiculous. All you have to do is reinforce the message, please take an action, leave this page, check your email. So we never want to overstate anything and distract our user. This one I love, footer illustrations. I hate footer illustrations because they're literally there to fill in space. They're not serving any narrative purpose. It's not saying anything to the user. It's just like dividing a design. And this is something that I got from my days on Google Doodles, is there is no such thing as a bummer illustration. We never want someone to remember a bad moment that they had on Airbnb. This is literally a request to break up with Airbnb. I don't want to hear from you. You've been in my inbox too much, and just stop talking to me. So we never want to ship them like a patronizing, oh, so sorry to see you go illustration, because like, why would you want them to remember that? And if I would leave you with anything, it would be that illustration is not decoration, it's communication. So use illustration wisely. It's there for your brand, it's there for your voice, and it's always there to serve a function and not just decorate a page. So thank you very much.